Political democracy doesn't work. Not at all. The scum rises to the top. Cunning, evil, greedy, completely selfish scum. Monarchs at least considered the country their property. They treated it as their own possession. And these, politicians come to steal as much as possible and then try to make sure they don't get caught and hung up by the ribs on hooks. A politician seems to have three main objectives. The first is to get to the top by any means necessary, and I mean any means. The second is to line their pockets by any means necessary, and the third, the last one, is to cover their tracks by any means necessary. And where is the concern for the people in all this? I don't think it's visible at all. Why did I bring this up, so to speak? The thing is, I posted this message, the one I just read to you, about these countries, on Telegram on the new channel, Leon Weinstein US, with the same name as this channel. Yes, I posted it and started thinking, here we have a concrete example right in front of us. It's almost like a deliberate confirmation of my point. Well, just look. From the very beginning, what is called a special military operation in Russia, we simply, and maybe foolishly, call a war. Right? In February 2022, Moscow viewed the territory of Belarus not just as a rear base, but as a potential second front. The logic of the Kremlin was clear, right? Launching an offensive from the north, from the Gomel and Brest regions, would have forced Ukraine to stretch its defenses for hundreds of additional kilometers, divert reserves from Donbass in the south, and potentially create a threat to Kyiv itself, along fronts that, until, let's say, 2022, were considered secondary. In the first weeks of the war, this partially happened. Belarusian territory was used as a launching pad for strikes. Kyiv was attacked through the Chernobyl zone, but Lukashenko did not go further than that and did not let Russia in for 4 years, despite constant increasing pressure. Why Lukashenko never sent his own army into the war is a question without a clear answer, and any version here remains a hypothesis. Lukashenko, by the way, really likes to call himself Batko. He really likes this image. He's as much a Batko as a Matko, but has personal reasons for avoiding this slaughter. It's not because he's the father of the people. The first and most obvious reasons are his relations with the West. Lukashenko, despite all his dependence on Moscow, has always played a double game, balancing between his Russian patrons and maintaining minimal openness to dialogue with Europe and the US. Full-scale entry into the war on Russia's side would mean complete and irreversible toxicity for him. The closure of any channels, even for the distant future, total sanctions, and the status of a full participant in aggression, not just an accomplice. Everyone knows he's an accomplice because he's under pressure, right? Lukashenko, judging by his behavior, was counting on the configuration changing someday, and he kept himself, how should I put it, in a position to maneuver. The second version is the condition of his own army. The Belarusian armed forces have not participated in any real combat operations for many years. Their combat readiness, motivation, and equipment raise questions. Even among the old supporters of Minsk, Lukashenko could clearly understand that sending his army into the war is not a demonstration of strength, but a risk of exposing its weakness. In real combat, it would be a disaster for his personal prestige and for the internal stability of the regime. The third version is domestic politics. Any war is unpopular among the Belarusian population, whose sense of kinship with Ukraine is quite evident. It differs from the propaganda rhetoric of Russian media. Lukashenko, who holds on to power without, let's say, broad legitimacy, all right? After 2020, I see almost zero legitimacy there. He couldn't afford the risk of mass discontent, especially considering that a significant part of Belarusian society has family and cultural ties with Ukraine. As a result, after 4 years, Russia and Belarus have come to a compromise that can be called minimally sufficient participation, the deployment of radar and other systems on Belarusian territory. The guidance systems, which, according to the Ukrainian side, are used to coordinate strikes by Russian drones on the western and northern regions of Ukraine, are still being used. And, so to speak, the supply of gasoline and diesel fuel to Russia is increasing, having grown several times over in the first months of 2026, according to Ukrainian data. And this is clearly, so to speak, in line with the fact that, well, because the Ukrainians are striking at Russian energy infrastructure, that's what actually happened. This is the price that Belarus is paying in order not to deploy its army, a minimal but real contribution that allowed Lukashenko to formally remain a non-belligerent, while Moscow was able to get at least something from an ally who stubbornly refuses to truly fight. And now something is happening that could bring down this fragile structure, which has stood for 4 years. June 19 and 21. Twice this year. Just now, Volodymyr Zelensky publicly issued an ultimatum to Minsk through his Telegram channel, demanding that within a week they dismantle the relay stations in the Homel, Hrodna, and Brest regions and stop supplying fuel to Russia. Otherwise, according to the Ukrainian president, we will do it ourselves. In other words, Kyiv is openly declaring its readiness to strike targets on the territory of Belarus. Well, something like, hey, smack, come here and kiss my heel, because if you don't, I'll raise such hell you won't know what hit you. So what kind of reaction would any halfway decent hooligan have? Let's stop and ask the question directly. What could such a blow objectively lead to? I'm not even saying silly words. Fine, a strike. If Ukrainian drones really hit Belarusian radar installations or fuel and oil depot infrastructure, oil refinery logistics servicing Russia, the reaction from Minsk is inevitable. It's impossible to imagine a situation where Belarus, being under the actual economic and military patronage of Russia, would refuse to cooperate with Moscow in response to a strike on its territory. But this contradicts the very logic of the Allied relations of the past 4 years, which were described above. In the same way, it's simply impossible to imagine that the Belarusian leadership would be scared by threats and expel the Russians. Lukashenko simply has neither the mechanism nor the motivation for such a step. A much more likely scenario is the exact opposite. A strike on Belarusian territory gives Moscow exactly what it couldn't achieve in 4 years of military, diplomatic, and economic pressure on Belarus. Russia will no longer need to persuade, bargain, or offer new guarantees. It gets what is called a casus belli for Lukashenko, and this time neither Russian propaganda nor Kyiv can be blamed for it. The logic is they attacked us, we are defending ourselves. It works flawlessly for any regime, even the people will understand it, and Minsk gains legitimacy in the eyes of its own population, a pretext for retaliatory actions, which he hasn't had all these years. Previously, those were other people's conflicts and we avoided interfering. Now it's different. These are our conflicts and our losses are our own. There's a second, more subtle effect. As a precedent, if Ukraine strikes a country that is formally not at war but supports the aggressor with infrastructure and fuel, Moscow gets the reciprocal right to make the same claim. That means you can strike anyone who helps the enemy, even if they're not directly involved in the conflict but are providing assistance. And this opens up the possibility for strikes against the logistics, infrastructure, and territory of NATO countries and others that supply Ukraine with weapons, intelligence, and fuel, even though they are not formally parties to the conflict. The principle that anyone who helps becomes a legitimate target works both ways, and by striking Belarus, Kyiv has effectively established this principle in the international practice of this conflict, even against its own supply allies. Perhaps this is being done on purpose. To achieve such a goal as to involve Russia through retaliatory strikes, although that too sounds crazy. Now actually, let's move on to the scenario of further developments. Let's suppose it really comes to a strike. Ukrainian drones destroy radar installations and cause serious damage to the fuel infrastructure. Well, in Belarus, yes. Minsk, under pressure to protect its sovereign territory and under pressure from Moscow as its senior ally, ends up being forced to respond within a time frame of 1 or 2 months. This realistically means the direct deployment of the Belarusian army to the border with a transition to limited offensive actions or at the very least regular strikes from Belarusian territory on Ukrainian targets, without a formal declaration of war but with the actual opening of a second front. For Ukraine, this will mean the need to defend the north, Zhytomyr, Rivne, Volyn, and Chernihiv regions, against the army, and their actual combat effectiveness is little known, but they have the key advantage of any new army in a prolonged war. They are fresh and have not been worn down by 4 years of fighting, while the Russian army, according to numerous independent assessments, is having problems with replenishment, is fatigued by long battles, and is facing difficulties with mobilization. The Belarusian army is a completely untapped resource. Even with modest combat capability, the appearance of a new, not yet exhausted enemy in a new direction, this is a huge burden on Ukraine's already overloaded defense system. A logical question arises. Why? Why would the Ukrainian leadership do this? They fully understand all these risks. And in Zelensky's government, there are obviously professionals, not idiots. Why would they deliberately create the conditions for the worst possible scenario? Here we can formulate several versions, staying within the realm of theory rather than established facts. Let's start with version 1. The Ukrainian leadership sincerely believes that the threat is purely demonstrative and will not lead to an actual strike, but will only force Minsk to dismantle specific facilities under the pressure of a public ultimatum. This version suggests a serious underestimation of the logic behind the allied relationship between Moscow and Minsk. The second version is a way to demonstrate activity and initiative to Western partners. I'm Tarzan, I beat my chest whenever I want. This is against the backdrop of a stagnant front, with no regard for the real military losses. That is, priority is given to short-term political effect, not to strategic calculation. This is only done if you think the war will end soon, and I'm just holding on like the Iranians. Right now, we can send as many missiles at you as we want, while hoping it'll all be over in 2 weeks. The third version. This is the most worrying. The Ukrainian leadership is actually ready to strike, believing that even partial involvement of Belarus is a manageable, localized risk that can be offset by Western military aid, while underestimating the cumulative effect. Opening a border more than 1,000 kilometers long for a country that already lacks enough personnel, not even enough to hold its own existing front line. Whichever of these versions turns out to be true, the final result for the Ukrainian people, if events really follow the escalation scenario, will be the same. The emergence of a new front, new borders, requires defense. New casualties among the military and civilian population, which would not have been inevitable but will become the consequences of a decision made by the leadership of Ukraine without any military necessity. And there is no room for an optimistic outcome here, because there is no optimism here and there cannot be any. There is an assumption about the development of events according to the described scenario, so if it is confirmed, then we are not just talking about a strategic planning mistake. This is a decision that deliberately creates an additional front where there wasn't one, and I want you to hear this again. It creates an additional front where there wasn't one. It voluntarily multiplies the number of directions that need to be defended with the lives of Ukrainian soldiers for the sake of a questionable short-term effect. The worst thing you can imagine, I don't even know what the Ukrainian leadership could have come up with for its own people. The worst thing is to open a second front on your own where, for 4 years, there was a fragile but functioning status quo. If this action happens, if it really turns into a second front, and thousands of Ukrainians end up under attack from an army that appeared where it hadn't been before, then all of this will happen solely because of Kyiv's own completely unforced decision and initiative. It would be impossible to call it anything other than direct complicity in the mass death of its own citizens, carried out by the hands of its own government. There is also a broader context that encompasses everything described above. It seems that the Ukrainian elite, including Zelensky and the people around him, are doing everything they can to make sure that the war, God forbid, does not end. If this assumption is correct, it means the following. These people are desperately afraid of the moment the conflict ends, the moment when the country will have the opportunity to calmly assess what happened before and during the war, and will start counting the money coming from the US, then from Europe. The opening of a new front with Belarus in this context is just one of the tools to postpone that moment, along with any other action that defines the conflict. I deliberately emphasize that this version borders, well, on conspiracy theory, and that's normal. It's hard to imagine such stupidity at the level of state leadership, but if we assume that it's not stupidity, but calculation. Gentlemen, their calculations are monstrous, gentlemen. Their scale is monstrous. It means a very simple thing. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians will continue to die on the battlefield. Hundreds of thousands more will die under Russian bombs in their own cities. And hundreds of thousands more will leave the country, fleeing wherever they can, just to survive. All this is happening not because the war objectively cannot end, but because someone specifically needs it to continue. Otherwise, he, his inner circle, and those close to him will have to answer for what happened with the money and the decisions made over these years. In other words, if this version is true, and to me it really does seem like the truth, the population of Ukraine ends up as hostages while a group of people essentially robs them, keeping the country in a state of war, not for the sake of victory or protection, but for their own survival, to stay in power, to keep what they've stolen. And now, here's another episode from the same story, which unfortunately fits exactly into the logic of everything described above. That same Zelensky demanded that the format of negotiations with Russia be determined by Europe. Well, fine, let it be, but at the same time, the specific negotiators from Europe will be chosen by Kyiv. Let's focus on this in more detail. Because the wording looks, well, kind of harmless, but in fact, this is a demand that Russia can never accept under any circumstances. We're not talking about neutral mediators, Switzerland, the UN, or someone else from a third party with no interest and no stake in the outcome of the war. No, we're talking about that very Europe, which has been the main sponsor of the Ukrainian army, supplying weapons, money, and intelligence for years. To put such a party, to seat such a party at the negotiating table not as an observer but as a co-author of the format, and essentially the arbiter of the process, means to ask Russia to negotiate on terms set by an arbiter who is at the same time its adversary. It's like inviting North Korea to be the judge and arbiter in this situation. It's exactly the same. Absolutely. There's another important layer here. If Ukraine has received about $90 billion in aid over the years of the war from Europe, and now from the U.S. Congress, and from the U.S. as well, so to speak, there was some more money coming in, right? It's very hard to imagine that these amounts went through without some personal interest from the top officials of European countries, without their involvement in the distribution and control of these funds. This is not an accusation. It's a matter of common sense. Money of this scale doesn't pass by those who authorize it. And if this hypothesis is correct, then these are the figures Zelensky wants to see. Then the negotiators and arbitrators from Europe may have a personal interest in making sure the war and the related financial flows continue for as long as possible. Add this to the Belarusian episode. On one hand, it's a strike that opens a new front where the status quo had held for 4 years. On the other hand, it's proposing terms the other side will definitely reject, making it seem like an offer. If they accepted, things would change, but they said no. It doesn't look like two random, unrelated decisions. It looks like two independent steps aimed in the same direction. Both objectively move any real chance of ending the conflict further away, and both reinforce the idea that this is not a mistake, ladies and gentlemen, but a calculated move. So here is the question for you, gentlemen. What are your thoughts on Ukrainian leadership's actions? Do they indicate that they want to stop the military actions? Or do they indicate that they want to continue them for as long as possible? Imagine that Russia today withdraws all its troops from Ukraine, pays reparations to Ukraine, apologizes, and sends Putin to The Hague to court. Naturally, that chance is just as likely as the chance that Russian oligarchs will get down on their knees and beg Ukrainian oligarchs to take all their assets, including ships, villas, planes, and other little accessories like mistresses. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be waiting for your answers. And here are the responses to the responses. And yes, I have a big request. Please don't get personal. But for now, until next time.